This prisoner needed to use the toilet, but the handcuffs were fixed too high on the pipe, making it impossible for him to squat, so he asked the guard to unlock the cuffs, but the guard knew how important this prisoner was and did not dare make the call, so he could only go ask the corporal for instructions, but the corporal did not dare decide either, so he went to the sergeant went to the lieutenant, and the lieutenant went to the captain, and just like that, the request was reported up level after level until the bathroom was packed with officers, yet still, not a single person dared decide to remove the handcuffs. In the end, only the general could step in, but looking at the absurd scene before him, the general only shouted, "Have you all lost your minds?" Then he turned and left. The others left with him. In the end, no one dared make a decision. Such a simple matter caused this much fuss only because this prisoner was one of the men who would help bring down the dictatorship. In 1973, the National Liberation Movement ended in failure. Uruguay's 10 years of democratic politics came to an end, and the country fell completely into dictatorship. In September of that same year, 9 organizers of the National Liberation Movement were secretly abducted by the military government. Among them, 3 important members of the Tupamaros guerrillas, José, Eleuterio, and Mauricio, were arrested. After that, they were blindfolded and secretly transferred to a hidden base. First, their shirts were stripped off and they were searched. After making sure they had no forbidden items, they were sent into the first prison, but before they could get used to the place, the guards covered their heads with prison uniforms and poured gasoline over them. Not only that, they were also ordered to stand straight, forbidden from leaning against the wall or squatting down to rest. Through the long night, only the bleak sound of rain kept them company. It was not until the next day that the obstruction over their eyes was removed, and the unease in their hearts eased slightly, but everything they could see was suffocating. The surroundings were steeped in despair, and even the words carved into the wall by those who came before were no exception. Abandon all hope. You who enter here, only a single window leading to the outside world felt like a gift from heaven, silently soothing their hearts. Not long afterward, the written orders arrived. The 3 men were forbidden from speaking to one another, and they were not even allowed to talk to the soldiers. Their basic human rights were completely stripped away. What awaited them next was endless loneliness, but even so, they still followed their own rhythms and learned to keep themselves together inside their cells. What they never expected was that the only window that let in light would suddenly be sealed tight with a shade. The sound of soldiers hammering nails felt as if each blow landed directly on their hearts. And so, they suffered through 12 hours in boundless darkness. They thought things could not get worse, never knowing the torture had only just begun, because under pressure from many sides, the dictator could not execute them, and could only try to destroy their minds. After they had finally adapted to the darkness, they were quickly transferred to another prison. All along the way, they were forced to wear hoods, and every step beneath their feet was filled with uncertainty. Even though they looked stripped of all dignity, even though each man was held alone with his body chained to a limited range around the bed, they still did everything they could to remain decent. After meals, they wiped their teeth with strips of cloth, and even when relieving themselves, they kept to a fixed corner far from the bed. But one day, a dictator from the National Army suddenly came into the cell. In a threatening tone, he told the 3 men separately that because of public pressure, their lives would temporarily be made a little easier, but that did not mean the military had compromised. On the contrary, the 3 of them were no longer prisoners, but hostages at the military's mercy. If anyone outside dared launch another uprising, the military would execute them immediately. Even if everything outside remained calm, the military would not go easy on them. They would find every possible way to torment the 3 men until they could no longer bear it, either losing their minds or ending their own lives. But the dictator clearly failed to understand that those determined to change Uruguay often possessed a will far beyond ordinary people. After the conversation ended, the 3 men were blindfolded and dragged to stools to have their hair cut. They were also blasted with high-pressure hoses, washing the filth from their bodies. At first, the powerful streams and icy drops of water caused them intense discomfort, but soon, their longing for clean water made them excited. After their bodies were finally cleaned, they were examined by a doctor. Although there were no obvious fatal wounds on his body, years of abuse had left him battered from head to toe. Even the doctor could not help feeling pity when she saw them. After some time, under outside pressure, Mauricio was allowed to meet his family. Although the military had cleaned him up and restored his original appearance, the moment his parents saw him, they immediately sensed something was wrong, because not only was his face deathly pale, his body was so thin it looked as if it might break at a touch. Still, to reassure his family, He forced out a smile and even asked about his daughter's schoolwork, but his 7-year-old daughter did not know how to pretend, and tears of sadness immediately fell. Just as he wanted to speak and comfort her, his white-haired father, unable to accept the reality of his imprisonment, suddenly suffered a relapse of dementia. Then his father collapsed to the ground, struggling like a fish out of water. Mauricio, unable to control his emotions any longer, desperately wanted to rush out and check on his father, but the soldiers forcibly restrained him and locked him back in his cell. Time soon moved to 1975, the 803rd day of their imprisonment. To make absolutely sure nothing went wrong, the military transferred them again. Mauricio and Eleuterio were locked in 2 narrow adjacent basements. Stretching out an arm was enough to measure the width of the basement. Food and water depended entirely on whatever the guards chose to give them, but the soldiers had grown used to doing evil. Not only would they give the 2 men a little food only once every few days, sometimes they would even pour urine over their heads while they drank water. Because the space was so small, they had nowhere to hide. José's situation was even worse. He was held alone inside an oval-shaped barrel cell, with only birds to keep him company each day. Over time, he began hearing things, and his mind seemed to be on the edge of collapse. Only on Christmas Day, when he saw brilliant fireworks through the window, did his emotions gradually settle. At the same time, Mauricio received a tasty meal. Even though it was someone else's leftovers, he did not mind at all and stuffed it into his mouth in big bites. Eleuterio, who could neither see the fireworks nor receive anyone's attention, was inspired by the sound of firecrackers and began trying to tap on the wall with his hand. He tried to use this to attract Mauricio's attention, and the clever Mauricio soon heard it and responded. Then the two began their long-awaited communication through Morse code. At first, they could only simply say goodnight to each other. After all, Morse code was not easy to interpret, but after a full year of non-stop tapping, they had become extremely skilled at using it. They could even play chess without a board to pass the time. It was precisely because they had each other's company that, through the turn of seasons and in such brutal conditions, they managed to keep a positive and hopeful state of mind. However, years of tapping wore thick calluses onto their fingers. During this period, Eleuterio once got a chance to go outside to use the toilet, but he was handcuffed to a pipe by the soldiers, leaving him unable to squat, so he asked them to unlock the cuffs. Otherwise the waste would dirty the toilet, but the soldier had no authority to decide and could only ask a superior for instructions. Then the superior reported to another superior, and in the end, the matter went nowhere. Fortunately, Eleuterio gained something from the disaster. For a moment, there was no enemy watching him. He secretly took some used newspapers from the wastebasket. Then, after returning to his cell, he shared the news with Mauricio. This was the only news from the outside world they had heard in 3 years. Meanwhile, José, on the other side, fell into severe auditory and visual hallucinations after the endless torment of loneliness. One day, he even saw the figure of his mother. What he did not know was that his mother really was only a wall away from him. It turned out that ever since José was imprisoned, his mother had been asking everywhere about his whereabouts. Only on this day, 3 years later, did she finally find a tiny clue? But when she asked to visit him, she was refused without mercy. Even after waiting in the rain for an entire day, she received not the slightest pity. Even more heartbreaking and hopeless, that very night, José, Mauricio, and Eleuterio were transferred to another prison. This time, the cell walls were not only thick enough to completely cut off any chance of communication among the 3 men, but the already narrow space was further divided into an even smaller area where they were allowed to move. Because the guards kept patrolling above, Mauricio did not dare cross the line even slightly. Just as he was about to collapse, a turning point suddenly arrived. One guard often talked with his companion about a girl he liked very much, but he could never win her over and could only complain about it every day. After hearing this, Mauricio impatiently said that complaining all day was useless, and he might as well write a love letter to confess. At first, the prideful guard harshly scolded Mauricio, but after his partner left, he secretly came back to Mauricio for advice. Mauricio already had an exceptional literary gift. In just a few words, he distilled a passionate love poem and soon helped the guard win the girl he loved. Perhaps because he had once again proved his own worth, Mauricio could not help showing a relieved smile. But one day, while he was sleeping, he was suddenly dragged away roughly by the guards. He thought the secret had been exposed and that he would be severely punished. Unexpectedly, the prison lieutenant also needed emotional advice. Instantly relieved, Mauricio took the paper and pen from the man. First, he deeply smelled the scent of the paper, then moved his stiff wrist and wrote an incredibly moving poem. Because the result was excellent, The lieutenant, to show his gratitude, not only gave Mauricio paper and pens for free, but also prepared tasty food for him from time to time. Even when listening to soccer matches on the radio, the lieutenant would deliberately turn the volume all the way up, sharing a brief moment of joy with him. Unfortunately, the good days did not last long, and soon the three men were transferred again. Thankfully, during a stop to urinate along the way, the soldier guarding them showed mercy and removed their hoods. They bathed in the sunlight while taking one look at the beautiful mountains and rivers of their homeland. But after that brief taste of freedom, they were shoved into an even narrower and more cramped space. There was not a single vent around them, and even standing up was difficult. The only light came from the bulb above their heads, but the flickering light only made the already tense three men even more agitated and depressed. The first one who could no longer bear it was Eleuterio. But one day, he suddenly had a dream. In the dream, he went camping by the river with his wife and daughter. His wife seemed to sense his sadness and patiently comforted him, saying everything would end, and no matter how hard it was, he had to hold on. Although after he woke, the warm embrace and the happiness of having his wife and daughter beside him vanished. From then on, Eleuterio once again had the strength to keep living. By contrast, Jose, who had already suffered frequent hallucinations and voices, seemed to grow even worse. Every day, he felt as if someone were drilling deep into his brain with an electric drill. Then he would remember the day he was arrested. At that time, he was eating with friends in a restaurant. A man wearing glasses suddenly walked in. Watching the man approach again and again, Jose knew his identity had been exposed and immediately knocked him to the ground. Then he hurriedly ran out of the restaurant, only to crash straight into a police officer. The officer fired several shots at him, but Jose did not die. After a long rescue effort, his vital signs returned, because his identity was special, and he knew a great deal of secret information. But no matter how much torture he endured, he always remained silent. In the end, the enemy had no solution and could only keep him under tight imprisonment. Now, it was already the 5th year of his captivity, and the most painful one. After that, he and the other two men were transferred to a new prison. Time had reached 1979. By then, the cell conditions had improved greatly. They not only had relatively comfortable beds, but also clean pillows and bedding. One day, Eleuterio was even lucky enough to meet his young daughter. Although the time he spent with her was extremely brief, he was happy for many days afterward. After some time, the International Red Cross began humanitarian visits, inspecting prisons one by one to ensure prisoners could enjoy basic human rights. At first, to cope with the inspection, the guards placed tables, chairs, and stools in every cell, as well as newspapers, books, and radios for entertainment. They even cleaned the place for the first time in ages. Because of this, Jose and the other two men lived relatively comfortable lives for a while. The moment Jose heard news from the outside world through the radio, his heart, long crushed under pressure, was so moved that tears streamed down his face. However, when they were taken one by one before the Red Cross members for interviews, all of them kept silent about the injustice they had suffered, because they knew very well that telling the truth at that moment would not bring a good result, and might instead bring harsher punishment. Sure enough, as soon as the inspection ended, everything returned to normal. What Eleuterio never expected was that the doubling bedding method he casually wrote on a bar of soap would make the military mistakenly think he was plotting something again. Although after some explanation, he successfully cleared himself of suspicion, the painful memories of the past surfaced in his mind. On the morning of April 14, 1972, Eleuterio was discussing plans with his comrades when he suddenly heard the roar of the dictator's car arriving. So he and another colleague hurriedly hid in the ceiling of the bathroom. Only a couple who had been secretly helping them stayed behind to deal with the military. But the military had never intended to negotiate. Instead, following the principle of killing the innocent rather than letting one person escape, they opened fire on the entire house. The unprepared couple died on the spot. Eleuterio, hiding in the ceiling, was also shot several times. Fortunately, he and his colleague escaped the first round of searching that followed. Unfortunately, blood from his wounds dripped through the cracks in the ceiling onto the floor. This caused both him and his colleague to be captured in the end. Now, his colleague's whereabouts were unknown, and no one even knew whether he was alive or dead. Eleuterio felt deeply guilty because of this, but he never regretted joining the liberation movement. Even trapped in prison at that moment, he firmly believed that dictatorship would one day collapse. Meanwhile, Jose finally got to see his mother as he had wished, but the moment his mother began to speak, he stopped her, because he believed someone had installed a listening device in his brain to uncover the secrets he refused to reveal. Hearing this, his mother immediately realized that her son was already on the edge of collapse, so she stood up and scolded him sternly, saying they were deliberately trying to drive you mad. But you cannot let them win. Believe that no one can take away your mind. Learn to fight back. As long as you make it through, the world will open up again. At first, Jose did not know how to fight back, until one day, looking out the window at a mobilization meeting attended by officers and civilian representatives, he suddenly began shouting, while demanding the mate tea and chamber pot his mother had brought but the guards had withheld. He also denounced the injustice he had suffered. The prison warden flew into a rage when he heard it, because outwardly, the military had always claimed the prisoners were neither exploited nor abused. If the truth were exposed, it would certainly backfire. So he rushed to the cell, trying to control Jose's so-called madness. Unexpectedly, the clever Jose had already discovered clues about the warden's affair. Left with no choice, the warden could only beat Jose badly. After venting his anger, he then granted Jose's request. Otherwise, his reputation might very well be ruined. Not only that, under Jose's strong insistence, the warden also arranged for him to receive treatment, because Jose insisted that an antenna had been implanted in his head. Although the doctor clearly said that Jose had developed paranoid psychosis due to a lack of rest and sleep. If he took some sleep medication, his condition might improve. At the same time, the doctor also told him to hold on to any belief he could grasp, even religion, but Jose said he did not need sleep. What he needed was to stop thinking, and to read and write. Besides, if God truly existed, why was he so cruel, and why did he not reach out to help him? If God did not exist, and the doctor said he had lost his mind, then what exactly could he still hold on to? Now, I can barely even see the stars, and you are still discussing reason with him. What reason can I possibly have left now? After a moment of silence, the doctor told him a story of her own. When she was 15, the doctor watched her mother die of cancer with her own eyes, and decided to become a doctor. Later, she finally made that dream come true. Over 20 years, she had treated thousands upon thousands of patients, but one day, she suddenly fell into confusion, no longer knowing what meaning any of it had. But soon, she figured it out. No matter what she did, she could never bring her mother back to life. So she returned to her work and did her job as well as she could. Now, she also asked Jose to do everything he could and hold on to whatever belief he could grasp until the daylight arrived. And she believed that day was not too far away. Before he knew it, tears flickered in Jose's eyes. After that, he never hallucinated again. Time soon moved to 1980. The dictator announced a new political program, but it was met with fierce opposition from the people. This also meant that Uruguay was already moving toward a democratic system, because the guards felt a powerful sense of defeat. They poured all their anger onto Jose and the other two men. Not only that, over the next 2 years, the three men were repeatedly sent to cells with extremely harsh conditions. It was not until 1983, on the 3,883rd day of their imprisonment, that their lives finally improved again, because they were sent back to a prison they had been in before. And the person in charge of this prison was the very lieutenant Mauricio had once helped write a love letter. By now, the lieutenant had married his girlfriend and was living an extremely happy life. To show his gratitude, he agreed to one rule-breaking request from Mauricio. That request was to allow the three men to see one another. And so, after long years of closed-off imprisonment, Mauricio, Jose, and Eleuterio finally reunited under the sunlight. Although by then, the erosion of time and suffering had left them aged and weak, the moment their eyes met, it seemed as if everything they had endured turned into sunlight. That sunlight draped their whole bodies in gold and drove away the shadows in their hearts. 1 year later, they were transferred again, because it was nighttime, and only the three of them were left inside the vehicle. They removed one another's blindfolds. Through the gap in the window, they saw the lights of countless homes for the first time in a long while. In addition, as the voices against dictatorship outside grew louder and louder, the treatment of the three men inside the prison clearly improved greatly. The cells that had once been dim and cramped were now spacious and bright, and were equipped with a toilet and a sink. Occasionally, they could even receive cigarettes and matches, and they also gained the chance to go outside for fresh air. One day, it happened to be Eleuterio's turn to go outside and bask in the sun. When the other prisoners saw him, they all shouted his name. Mauricio and Jose also cheered for him excitedly, clearly filled with admiration, and Eleuterio used the motion of taking a soccer shot to show his determination to win. Time slowly moved forward to 1985. Jose, full of hope for the future, carefully planted a seed in the chamber pot his mother had brought him. Soon, under his careful care, the seed sprouted, and when the tender shoot grew and bloomed into a flower, he, Mauricio, and Eleuterio finally ended 12 years and 4,323 days of imprisonment. Interestingly, when they were released, all of them signed a statement declaring that they had never suffered unfair treatment. Eleuterio, as usual, even wiped every pot, bowl, ladle, and basin clean before slowly leaving under Mauricio's urging. As the bus they were riding drove out of the prison, the three men truly felt the air of freedom and democracy. What moved them even more was that along the way, they saw many welcome banners prepared especially for them. The banners read, "We have never forgotten a single fighter." Finally, the bus arrived at its destination. Amid the cheers of the crowd, the three men crossed 12 years of thorns and tightly embraced the families who had been waiting for them. After that, with their wills tempered even stronger, each of their lives opened a new chapter. Eleuterio, relying on his ability and influence, was elected senator and served as Minister of Defense. Mauricio devoted himself to the arts, becoming a poet, novelist, and playwright, and also served as Director of Culture. José, at the age of 75, was elected President of Uruguay in 2010. After taking office, he rejected luxury, refused to live in the presidential residence, and continued living on his own farm. Every day, he drove an old car to and from work, with only 2 bodyguards and a dog at his side. Not only that, he also donated most of his salary. Because of his simple lifestyle and selfless dedication, he was called the poorest president in the world. He was also ranked among the 5 most influential people in Latin America. As long as you still have something to hope for, you will not be defeated. Likewise, as long as you do not give up the fight, the world will eventually open wide, because time is the best remedy against suffering. No matter how impossible the struggle before you may seem, time always moves forward. As long as you do not give up, as long as you stay alive, the darkness will eventually pass, and the long night will surely meet the dawn.